Alright, hello again, and this video is about the covers and contents of my very small but nice science fiction digest collection, which focuses on the title Imagination. If you know anything about science fiction history and pulp publishing, you know that the pulp magazines of the 30s were large format magazines which focused on what they call the B.E.M covers, the bug-eyed monster covers, which typically had some sort of creature menacing some sort of beautiful girl, being with some sort of spaceman with a ray gun running in at the corner or from the background into the rescue. By the 1950s, most of the science fiction magazines had turned into digest format, and most of the big titles like Galaxy and Asimov's and the other big titles of the era, Astounding, had gone to what could best be called more cerebral colors. I don't know if I'm even saying that right. More intellectual look, trying to class up science fiction a little bit, whereas Imagination was the one title that stuck more with the tried and true pulp formula, both in terms of its content and in terms of its covers. And I love the old pulp era space opera style science fiction, and I love these covers. Some of these magazines I bought just for the covers, but I should stipulate that all of these magazines I've read all the stories in, because every time I buy something I feel obligated to read it. So let's just start off with the very first magazine in my collection, which is this issue, which has Beware the Usurpers by Geoff St. Renard in it. Excellent story along the same line of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, or the Heinlein story, The Puppet Masters. It's a story all about aliens mind-controlling humans, and it's a novelette. There are two other novelettes in the Usurpers trilogy, and I have to find those other two someday. Moving on up to another fine Imagination cover here, Dark Destiny by Dwight V. Swain. Imagination always had a novelette running in the lead feature, and Dwight V. Swain is sort of a poor man's Edgar Rice Burroughs, and here we see the classic bug-eyed creature, not bug-eyed creature, but creatures menacing the gorgeous 50s blonde there, and that's quite a nice cover. Here's another one that I like a lot. I didn't know anything about this author. I just bought this based on the cover, which I love, of the giant ghost woman. She's sort of a ghost apparition woman who's destroying the city. Now here's one that I made a fridge magnet out of just because I love this. Armageddon 1970, which is also by Geoff St. Renard, who's the writer of the Usurpers story. See a nice picture here of flying saucers and nuclear blasts, which all took place back in 1970. You young people may not remember the Armageddon of 1970, but it was devastating. Those of us who are old enough to remember the 70s remember when the flying saucers were nuking the planet Earth. It was terrifying and devastating. And here we have Planet of Dread. Nice sex appeal cover with some sort of Burroughs-esque action going on, flying discs. We have the babe in the bikini with the holster and the cowboy boots / wrestling boots, these whip devices they're using to spill each other off their flying discs. Again, poor man's Burroughs. Dwight Swain's stories are enjoyable, but not particularly memorable. Let's put it that way. Slaves to the Metal Horde. How much do I love this cover? It's almost impossible to describe how much I love this cover. You've got these evil robots here, evil robot carrots with arms and legs, or pencils, or whatever you care to call them. We'll just leave it at that. If they've already hung the human, but is he going to molest the woman? I don't think so, because if you look closely, he's got another noose there, so they're apparently hanging humans, although why a big tough steel robot would feel the need to hang someone instead of just crushing their skull or something, I don't understand. But you can see there's quite a few of these robot creatures marching towards that burning city, or perhaps they're marching away from it. Perhaps their work is done now that the city's in flames. And here's why whoops, this is not an imagination, this is a universe. How'd that sneak in there? This is a good example of why I started reading these digests, was to get the stories of Edmund Hamilton, the pulp era author who created Captain Future back in the 30s. And here's a nice Edmund Hamilton novelette, Starman Come Home. It's got a classic pulp era style cover with the gorgeous babe and the guys in their tight. Why they always think that the future people will wear tight spandex costumes, I don't know. It's not comfortable. I think the future people will probably be comfortable. Now here's a great giant robot versus humanity cover. The Metal Emperor. And I love this robot. He's sort of a light bulb themed robot shape. And we've got some nice jet planes there, trying their best with some sort of zap beam there, but it doesn't seem to be really working very well. Unfortunately, it's damaged, very damaged magazine. Here is another nice flying saucer cover there. And you see the flying saucers just destroying the city, and these people are reacting pretty much how I think anyone would react if this was happening. I think they'd be looking up to see if skyscrapers are falling on them. Let's move the stack over. It's getting a little close. I'll start again here with The Secret of the Martians. Secret of the Martians. Oh, yeah. Now, this is another one I bought principally for the cover, and there's nothing remarkable about these stories, but we've got a full-blown nude there, albeit, you know, obviously it can't be shown from full frontal angle. But we've got this rather wimpy looking guy here. He's got pretty big bicep on his punching arm, not so much on the other arm. Punching Mr. Skin Disease here and into touching this. I guess I would assume that she's been put on some sort of conveyor belt into this stuff to destroy her, which obviously has a very destructive effect on his arm there because it's turning into a skeletal arm. Here's a nice Edmund Hamilton novelette, Thunderworld. Totally enjoyed that one. About people in robot suits trying to remake a planet and get it the atmosphere remade for humans, and then fortunately their personal traits lead them to murder and fight each other. Here's another good Hamilton novelette here, Citadel of the Star Lords, very enjoyable one. And we got a really nice cover here with flying saucers, and literally this is the Turn a Man Green with Nausea gun, apparently. But I personally would just do whatever she asked if I was this fellow. The Horde from Infinity, more from Poor Man's Burroughs, Dwight V. Swain. Got another nude here, almost full frontal if it wasn't for those very convenient electrical. Is that radiant power? Is that electricity? Is it steam? We don't know what it is. Battle Out of Time, more Dwight V. Swain. And here we see what could be a scene from ancient mythology, except in this case the Minotaur has been transposed into the future. But we know these costumes could have been basically almost any era. That's any era of burlesque, I would say. And this could be a Earl Flynn movie were it not for the gun. Now here's a great cover that you gotta love. Cosmic Destroyer. Giant woman eye blasts rocket ship, leading spacemen to wonder where their future truly lies. Now, here's another one. Here's a good one for you Star Trek fans, because obviously this guy is a member of the Federation, right? I mean, look at the shirt. Fugitive of the Stars by Edmund Hamilton. And you see a lot of alien creatures. I've seen very few alien creatures that look as completely alien as this thing. That's kind of what I imagine an alien creature would look like, is like something that you would never expect it to look like. It wouldn't look humanoid. This is pretty much what I expect a woman to be wearing on a cover of a pulp magazine or a science fiction magazine. I like the little floaty vehicle here. It's very nicely done. Now, I wasn't just kidding about this guy being a member of the Federation. Here's a quick quiz for you. Who was the spaceman who worked for the Federation? Was it Captain Future or was it Captain James T. Kirk? Have you got your answer ready? Okay, the correct answer is Captain Future worked for the Federation back in the 30s and 40s, and the Federation was an entity that it ran through many of Edmund Hamilton's novels and novelettes, and may well have been in this one as well, long before Captain Kirk worked for the Federation. So the whole idea of calling a galactic enterprise, if I may use that term, the whole idea of calling a galactic entity the Federation was created by Edmund Hamilton and probably swiped directly from his novels by the creators of Star Trek. So it's but the red shirt is probably just a coincidence. Here's a very nice UFOs invading cover with, you see a Lincoln Memorial there, it appears, and this giant robot tripod. The artist is sort of borrowing from multiple sources. You know, the tripods that zap the humans, that's a War of the Worlds thing. But we've combined the tripod with the UFOs, with the National Monument, with the soldiers, create a very collectible and very nice cover there. Here's another Edmund Hamilton novelette, Men of the Morning Star. That's a very evocative cover. You just don't want to go too near that thing, that's for sure. And here's the last of the imaginations, is the Corridor of the Suns. Corridor of the Suns. And this is, I like this cover a lot. It's got the robot, it's got the babe who's doing what babes do in these situations, cowering behind the man usually. Every now and then I'd like to see the half-dressed babe in the ray gun position shooting at the thing and the man cowering behind the woman, but that doesn't seem to come up very often. So that's a nice robot versus person cover. It always appears to be hopeless when you see a cover like this. The gun is clearly doing nothing, so it always looks like it's 1 second away from total disaster. On the other hand, the robot doesn't seem to be aiming his beams very well, so maybe there's hope that the robot is like completely myopic or blind or something. Now let's get into a few other little magazines here. Avon, these are also in my same stacks that the imaginations come from. I just want to mention these. Most of these digests are only worth between, I'd say, $2 and $5, depending on condition. You probably can't touch an Avon fantasy reader for less than $10. They're very collectible. There was a very short-lived series, and the reason they're so collectible is because they were extremely well edited, and they have great selection of stories and authors in every one. So even for $10 each, they're a good buy, because each one is such a good selection of authors and stories. And you can see that this one has C.L. Moore and Robert Bloch in it. Let me just look and see, just to try and prove my point, just look at random and see who else is in here. Yeah, we see that in addition to C.L. Moore, Robert Bloch, we have Carl Jacobi, we have Robert W. Chambers. You know, it's a good selection of authors. Here's another Avon fantasy reader, and the lead story here is by Sax Rohmer. We also have Arthur Merritt in this issue. We have C.L. Moore, very sexy cover there. I wish it wasn't so damaged with the markings of some news person's magic marker. Let's see, Lord Dunsey is also in this. Frank Bellhop Long is in this. You know, Clark Ashton Smith. It's Robert E. Howard. Great selection in every one of these of stories. And here's another great Avon fantasy reader. Nice cover there. The Flower Woman by Clark Ashton Smith. We've got Fritz Lieber in here, and Robert Bloch is in here. William Hope Hodgson's. I think this was the first William Hope Hodgson story I ever read. Lauren Dunsey is in here. Donald Wandry is in here. Fritz Lieber, Clark Ashton Smith. What a selection of stories in every one of these. They're totally worth having. Okay, let's move on here to, I just wanted to get some of these in. In the 1960s, there was several efforts to take advantage of the fact that many of the pulp stories from the 30s had gone into public domain. And this is one of the magazines that tried to take advantage of that, printing basically all public domain stories from the pulp magazine era. And I used to buy these if they had a Seabury Quinn in them. This one has The Cloth of Madness by Seabury Quinn. Now I should explain that if you're a magazine collector or a Lovecraft fan or a fan of Conan, you've probably heard of the magazine called Weird Tales. Weird Tales was where virtually all of Lovecraft's stories were printed during his lifetime. And they're also where the Robert E. Howard stories were printed for Conan and King Kull and Solomon Kane. But what may surprise you to find out is that Weird Tales had a very active letter column, and they polled their readers on every issue to find out which stories were most popular. Lovecraft was not popular. Lovecraft was only moderately popular. About half the readers loved his stories, and about half the readers hated his stories. And he was a very controversial writer. A lot of people would write in and say, we love Lovecraft, and a lot of people would write in and say, Lovecraft is horrible, please stop buying his stories. Robert E. Howard was popular, but it may interest you to know that Conan was actually his least popular character. A lot of people felt that the King Kull stories and the stories of Solomon Kane and the stories of Brule, the Spear Slayer, which had come before Conan, were Robert E. Howard's best stories, and that Conan was a step down from his earlier stories. So that's just an interesting bit of history. But the most popular author consistently in Weird Tales was Seabury Quinn, an author who's almost completely forgotten today, and his work has fallen back into obscurity with the exception of his novelette, Rhodes, which is still well remembered, one thing he's remembered for. But so I would buy these if they had a Seabury Quinn in them, because I was curious about the most popular author of Weird Tales. And here's another one, The Phantom Farmhouse by Seabury Quinn. And these have some good things in them. There's, you see there's H.P. Lovecraft and August Derleth in there. Here's another one of these. This one has Isle of Missing Ships by Seabury Quinn. All these Seabury Quinns are mostly Jules de Grandin stories. Jules de Grandin was a psychic detective, and his stories don't hold up particularly well. They're certainly not as good as the Robert E. Howard stories, but they were very popular at the time. And some of them are pretty good, but they're just pulp monster stories. House of Horror with Seabury Quinn. We have John Brunner, Edward Hotch. Got a pretty good lineup of people in some of these. This one has Lurking Fear by Lovecraft, House of the Hatchet by Robert Bloch, and The Mansion of Unholy Magic by Seabury Quinn, plus August Derleth, Edward Hotch, and Edgar Allan Poe. Quite an issue. Quite a nice issue. This one, I think I bought it just for the cover because it's got this great Virgil. That's not a Virgil Friendly. I thought it was, but it's signed there by Chamond cover. But it had Stragella, a story by Hugh B. Cave. Hugh B. Cave, another great pulp era writer of horror and weird menace stories. So that's why I bought that, was for the Hugh B. Cave stories. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention before I got completely away from the imagination stories is you probably know who Isaac Asimov is. And you may have even read Isaac Asimov's famous book, The Naked Sun, but if you've read it, you may not have realized that this book was originally marketed as being sexy. Now, it's pretty funny now because there's like basically nothing sexy in it. I mean, I listened to this book on a Books on CD audio recording of it that I got from the library many years ago. Never thought of it as sexy, but here it is in this advertisement being touted as a sexy book with this illustration. And they mention how there's a scene where a girl comes out of the shower and she's naked and she's talking to the guy, and that's completely normal in their culture. And it's clearly promoted as being a sexy book, which I think is pretty hilarious if you've ever read it. There's nothing sexy about Isaac Asimov's work, basically, so that's pretty interesting. Here's a nice issue of Fantastic, which I bought it because it had a story by Cornell Woolrich, the mystery author in it. And you can see this is actually a wraparound cover. I don't want to break the spine by trying to open it up wide enough so you can see it. But it's actually a wraparound cover. Then I opened this up, and what a cornucopia I found inside here. There is actually a science fiction novelette in this by Mickey Spillane. That's right, Mickey Spillane, The Veiled Woman by Mickey Spillane. The second story in here is by Richard Matheson, right? Then we have a story by Cornell Woolrich, and then there's a story down here by John Jakes. And there's also a reprint of an Edgar Allan Poe story. Now it's funny, Mickey Spillane, speaking of sex appeal, was known for being sexy. Now if you look at this illustration to go with the story, it appears that this guy is tearing down the top of this woman's evening gown in front of a room full of people. So the people thumbing through this, they're certainly trying to sell the aspect that this might be a sexy story. And then as we go further into the illustrations, we have some little kissing there, again selling the sex appeal of it. And then we get to this illustration, which if Familiar with Mickey Spillane's reputation at the time for being spicy, this appears to be a fully dressed man carrying a nude woman in this illustration. So they were clearly trying to sell you on the idea that there was something sexy going on in this story, even though there's nothing particularly sexy about it. It's actually a very disappointing story, and this Richard Matheson story is interesting. It's extremely short, but it's one of his first stories he sold to fit the crime. So it's very interesting from that aspect. The best story in here is the Cornell Woolrich story. Yeah, but it's pretty obvious from the Mickey Spillane story why he continued to write mystery thrillers and didn't write science fiction, because it's a pretty mediocre effort at science fiction. Here's another fantastic. It's Magic, You Dope. I bought this because Jack Sharkey, which may be a pen name, wrote the lead feature. Jack Sharkey, and also it has an Edgar Wallace story, and I'm a huge Edgar Wallace collector. It has the only Edgar Wallace story that's actually considered science fiction is Planetoid 127, and it's interesting. It's not one of Edgar Wallace's best stories, but Jack Sharkey, I knew from my childhood, wrote the paperback book version of the Addams Family TV sitcom show. They had a paperback come out with a photo on the cover of the Addams Family. It was a very funny treatment of the show, which created like a short scenario, a short. Each chapter was like its own short story about the Addams Family, and it was excellent. Most of those paperback versions of TV shows are not good, but that was an excellent one. So I was familiar with the name Jack Sharkey from that, and this is a pretty funny story. It's Magic, You Dope. Super Science, they put out this weird monster issue, and then they put out a second monster issue, Super Science, and you know, they're both pretty good. They're not particularly memorable. I got Robert Silverberg did one of the stories in there, but anything that says monster issue is a temptation to me when I'm looking at this kind of stuff. Now, you may remember a comic book that Simon and Kirby put out called Strange World of Your Dreams, where they tried to do a comic book series about people's dreams. I think it only lasted 5 or 6 issues. And they apparently tried the same thing in digest version, and here's a new kind of fiction, Dream World, stories of incredible powers. And many of these stories are supposedly based on ideas that people get from their dreams, or on dreams that people remember. I take that with a grain of salt. They seem to be pretty mundane, run-of-the-mill stories to me that follow the same patterns of all short stories of this type. So it was interesting. I thought I'd check it out. Nothing particularly memorable in there, but Dream World. Now this magazine I bought specifically because August Derleth has a story in it, who's known for being a collaborator with, or not, I don't know if you'd say collaborator, but a person who helped finish some of Lovecraft's unfinished stories, and then wrote a lot of Cthulhu mythos stories of his own. So this says a new Tex Harrigan adventure. So I thought, oh, August Derleth writing a sort of space opera pulp hero, that should be good. It was, it was okay. It wasn't anything outstanding, but a nice cover on that nonetheless. And the last one in this stack is Science Fiction Adventures. I bought this because it has the Star Combers, which is an Edgar Hamilton, I said Edgar, it's Edmund Hamilton novelette, and very nice cover there. Like that cover a lot. Oh, these things just happen to be in my pile, so they aren't digest, but let me just mention that this fanzine, niche magazine, The Paperback Fanatic, if you've ever, I own a couple of copies of this. This is always, it's kind of expensive, but if you're interested in old magazines, old paperbacks, if you're interested, here's some great art from German paperbacks. We can see some of that art in there. It's actually, this magazine, check this out. I made a fridge magnet out of this Afro girl whipping that white guy. And these are from German paperbacks. There's Indiana Jane. I don't know how well you can see some of this stuff, but this is worth looking at if you like this kind of art, because it always reprints a lot of weird and obscure stuff that you may not find anywhere else. So it's a niche magazine. We used to call these fanzines. I don't know if you'd actually call this a fanzine. This article in here about Sergeant Fury, the rat bastards, the sergeants. There's an article here about Fritz Lieber. So if you're a book or magazine collector, I totally recommend this fanzine / magazine. And this just happened to be with my digest, so I'm just going to show it. It's basically a paperback, but it's in a digest form. Arthur Merritt, author who I have a love-hate relationship with. I think some of his stuff is pretty boring. There's a novel he wrote called The Metal Monster, which I had to force myself to finish. It was so dull. But this particular book, The Ship of Ishtar, is a brilliant piece of fantasy writing. It's a classic, and everybody that likes fantasy fiction should read this. This is really a wonderful fantasy novel. It's probably, I think it's Merritt's best fantasy novel, but I haven't read all of his stuff, but I've read enough that I can say that with a lot of confidence that I do think it's one of his best ones. So strong recommendation on that. I don't know where this format came from, because it's more of a digest format than a paperback format. But yeah, so that's The Ship of Ishtar, and that's my stacks of digests. So that rounds out this video, and thank you for, oh, I had one other thing here, is this giant format magazine which is falling apart. This is actually the Steranko History of Comics, Volume 1. It's way too big. But if you look through here, this contains, I'm going to just turn this. This contains, it's way too big, but this contains some of the best articles on pulp magazines. Right here, the Bloody Pulp. This article is one of the best if you're interested in pulp magazines. And here's like the original Street and Smith ad for Doc Savage, which may have inspired the creators of Superman. There's all sorts of interesting stuff like that. And I'm going to take this and put it up there so you can see as I turn the pages that there's all sorts of magazine cover reproductions. And it's just totally worth having. A chapter on Batman. There's just wonderful stuff in here. So here's a chapter on Captain America. Strong recommendation that everybody get one of these Steranko History of Comics. They're a large format book that I bought it when it came out back around 72 or so. So that's a strong recommendation. And now I'm wrapping this video up, and I'll say goodbye till next time.